In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. That's a phrase Warhammer fans are probably getting a little tired of at this point. Like, yes, it's called the Hammers of War, not Hammers of Construction. But chances are that if you clicked on this video, you're probably already familiar with the basics of Warhammer. So if you're looking for someone to explain Warhammer lore in a way that non-lore nerds can understand, go watch Bricky's videos. You read the title. This is just going to be me attempting to briefly explain what I know in chronological order, and subsequently get crucified by the internet because I didn't mention the creation of the Officio Assassinorum at the correct time. So, without further ado, this is a simple man attempting to recount all of Warhammer history in less than 3,000 words. Alright, to begin, we have to go back in time a little bit. Scratch that, a lot of it. Scratch that, so long ago that people weren't even counting years yet. There is no date for the beginning of this story.
What do you mean?
But nevertheless, the story begins on a planet, in space, with the miracle of life. The Necrontyr, a race of beings that inhabited an unnamed planet. Now I say inhabited, but this unnamed planet isn't exactly the most hospitable when it comes to inhabiting. It lacks a protective atmosphere and is consequently constantly bombarded with high-energy radiation from its star. This spicy sun juice makes life as a Necrontyr not only miserable, but also drastically shorter than you'd expect. This means Necrontyr society is kinda kneecapped as to what it can achieve, because none of them actually live long enough to really progress the civilization. So an indeterminate number of years passes. Could be 10, could be 1,000, could be 1,000,000, nobody really knows. But eventually, the Necrontyr discover another race of ancient and powerful beings known as the Old Ones, who, compared to the Necrontyr, were essentially immortal. Now, the Necrontyr resented the Old Ones right off rip, because they were jealous, and rightfully so. But despite their resentment, the Necrontyr are said to have petitioned the Old Ones for the secret to the proverbial immortality juice, to which the Old Ones basically said, no. This rejection essentially redoubles the resentment factor among the Necrontyr. Not only are they immortal, but they won't share either. This festering anger ends up leading to the first major event in Warhammer history, the War in Heaven. The Necrontyr declare war against the Old Ones in an attempt to forcefully take what was not freely given. Now, as you might imagine, ancient hyper-intelligent beings, radiation-stricken, weak little green boys. Do I really need to spell it out? The Old Ones obviously win the initial phase of the War in Heaven, beating back the Necrontyr, imprisoning them on their homeworld for another indeterminate number of years. But during those years, the Necrontyr's anger festered even more, to the point where they made a vow against all life. Not just the Old Ones. During their imprisonment, the Necrontyr were searching desperately for something to effectively combat the Old Ones with, a weapon or perhaps an ally. And in their study of the stars, the Necrontyr discovered an ancient race of star beings that fed off solar radiation called the Catan, as in, the settlers of. Seeing an opportunity to pit the ancient beings of untold power against each other, the Necrontyr built mechanical bodies for the ethereal Catan to inhabit, at which point the Catan learned they like eating Necrontyr soul energy more than boring star energy, and the Catan offered the Necrontyr a deal to give them the immortality they always wanted. But this deal was in fact a scheme from the Catan to consume the Necrontyr souls. The Catan tricked the Silent King into transferring the Necrontyr consciousness into similar mechanical bodies that the Necrontyr had made for the Catan in the first place. But instead of a transference, the Catan just consumed their souls. As you do, rendering all but a few of the overlords mindless slaves to the Catan's will. Effectively, this was the end of the Necrontyr race. They inhabited new bodies and had no soul, so they adopted a new name, Necrons. The Catan and their newly founded immortal army once again took up battle against the Old Ones, reigniting the relatively stagnant war in the heaven. But this time, the turns were tabled. The ancient hyper-intelligent beings were this time up against star gods and an immortal army of Necrons deeply opposed to the concept of life. In an attempt to stave off this soul-powered invasion, the Old Ones created races of their own to defend themselves against the onslaught, among which were the Eldari, more commonly known as the Eldar, and the Orcs. The creation of these two major factions is arguably the second major event of the TLDR of Warhammer, but I'm going to lump this in with the War in Heaven, you know, for simplicity. I'll talk more about the Eldar in a minute, but probably won't mention the Orcs again, because most of Orc history boils down to, and then they were at war with everyone. Again. The Eldar's history is much more detailed and far more consequential. But let's finish up the War in Heaven. The races created by the Old Ones to fight off the Necrons didn't really develop fast enough to be helpful, and the Old Ones are thought to either be extinct or have fled the known galaxy entirely. Now, having accomplished the goal they had been striving for probably something to the tune of tens of millions of years, the Necrons, specifically their still sentient overlords, organized a revolt against their Catan gods. A revolution, a resistance, a mutiny, I don't know any more synonyms for that word, but one of these. And it was at this point that the Catan realized that their creations were perhaps a little too powerful, and the Catan were either killed or captured as Catan shards, their functionally limitless astral energies now completely at the Necrons' whim. But the battles had left Necron civilization in ruins, and the Eldar were on the rise, becoming more and more powerful. So, the Silent King ordered the remaining Necron worlds to be transformed into massive tombs, in which the Necrons would slumber, until the Eldar had faded from significance and the galaxy was ripe for conquering once more. So the Eldar. Oh boy, that's a story. The fledgling civilization was no longer fledging much. They'd become powerful, absolutely unparalleled in every scoring category. Technology that was indistinguishable from magic. In a world where literal magic actually exists. A golden age where they could materialize anything out of nothing. The Eldar were also masterful psychers, which greatly aided them as they expanded the sort of pocket dimension they had inherited from the Old Ones, called the Webway. The Webway is a dimension that exists outside both real space and warp space, an in-betweenium, if you will. Basically, all you need to know about the Webway is that it allowed the Eldar easy access to interstellar travel, without the need to travel through the madness-inducing warp. Easy FTL travel, large empire. Also, at some point around here, humankind began doing human things, but we still have a while to go before that matters. Eventually, the Eldar Empire got so big and so advanced that the Eldar standard of living was so high that they could have anything they could dream of with a wave of their hand. Now, as many movies and books out there have pointed out, sometimes there is a downside to having literally everything. For the Eldar, their lives began to lose purpose. They began to lose their connections with the world as their senses were dulled to the mundane life of having everything. Relatable, am I right? Now here's where it starts to get interesting. The Eldar's solution to this blandness was being a little more curious, a little more competitive, a little more everything. What happens if you just put a little bit of dog dew in the brownies? How do you know it doesn't taste good? You get the idea. But eventually, the only slightly dog-dewed brownies got boring as well. So the Eldar went, well, we'll just have to put more in, I guess. This sentiment, this insatiable need for new experiences, sensations, and discoveries got increasingly intense. So intense that their moral compass was eventually just completely dismantled. The once great Eldar society reduced to a mass of raving sadists, masochists, and lunatics, completely consumed with hedonistic, debauchocratical desires. I don't actually think that's a word, debauchocratical. The Eldar were so evil they got me making up words now. But hopefully that puts it into perspective. The Eldar became the most foul civilization you could ever imagine. and then 10 times worse. This was so much more than just your typical genocide and sadism. This was truly on another level. Surely it couldn't get any worse than this though, right? Wrong. All of this degeneracy the Eldar were indulging themselves in was getting broadcast directly into the warp. Here's the TLDR of how that works. The warp, sometimes referred to as warp space, is sort of an emotional, chaotic mirror of real space. So if you feel the big sad in real space, that emotional energy gets mirrored into the warp, feeding the corresponding chaos demons and gods that reside there. So the Eldar are broadcasting a whole slew of the worst emotions you can think of, and the ones you can't. And something on the other side has been slurping up all of those deliciously despicable juices. What may have only started out as a minor chaos god, or maybe not even a chaos god at all, eventually reached a critical mass, and suddenly manifested as a cruel reflection of the immense depths of depravity the Eldar had reached. It's at this point that we now arrive at the second major event in our story, the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Eldar. The fact that a single civilization's sheer emotional output could raise a being to the level of the now 4 major chaos gods that had been growing in power for literally millions of years, hopefully really puts into perspective just how terrible the Eldar became. When Slaanesh did finally burst forth, it's said that untold billions of Eldar souls were instantaneously devoured, just because of how deeply connected the whole civilization already was to Slaanesh, and because of how emotionally connected the Eldar were with each other. Slaanesh basically laid claim to every Eldar soul when they died in real space, even the ones who had fled Eldar society when the shit hit the proverbial fan, on massive continent-sized spacecraft called craft worlds. In a single fell swoop, a single moment even, the Eldar had sealed their entire species' fate as they fathered their own nemesis, sworn to hunt the Eldari to extinction and torture their souls for eternity. Fun fact before we move on to the next section. It wasn't just the Eldar who got whammied when Slaanesh joined the major chaos gods. All the sentient life around the Eldar Empire suffered terrible losses as the largest recorded rift in warp space tore through the galaxy. But this warp storm eventually abated, and the warp as a whole calmed significantly, having temporarily expended its rage, which gave way to the Age of Mankind. In an attempt to speed things up,
"We're almost there, my child. Just 20,000 more years."
I'm going to skip over the beginnings of humanity that occurred about the same time as the fall of the Eldar. All you need to know is that humankind was kind of a small empire. Because warp travel had a particular propensity to induce madness in its passengers. And the warp had gotten particularly angry during the fall of the Eldar, trapping large sections of mankind's colonies from much-needed supplies. This was known as the Age of Strife, which ended after Slaanesh was born and the warp temporarily calmed. It's at this point that I get to introduce maybe the most influential character in all of mankind's history, and our next major event, the Emperor of Mankind. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the origin of the Emperor, but there's too much conjecture for a historically accurate discussion, so I'm going to ignore that part entirely. What's important is that after the Age of Strife, a random man on Terra with no prior history or pedigree appeared and announced himself the Emperor of Mankind. Now, as you might imagine, at first, the people of Terra, who during the Age of Strife had devolved into barbaric tribes rather than a unified world, much like today, if you know what I mean, weren't particularly accepting of the self-proclaimed Emperor of Mankind. But the Emperor was committed to unifying Terra, and so began the Unification Wars, during which the Emperor used his immensely powerful psyker abilities in combination with his strategic mastery and technological brilliance to liberate the techno-barbarians from their misguided state of being. Fun fact, the Imperial Army used to unify Terra consisted of genetically enhanced soldiers called the Thunder Warriors, which would serve as the precursors/prototypes to the Space Marines. So after much big war, Terra stood united under the Imperial standard, and the Emperor turned his eyes to the lost human colonies among the stars. Starting with Mars, which was inhabited by the Cult Mechanicus, advanced technophiles who blended science with religion and worshipped a machine god, the Omnissiah. Now, the Emperor wasn't particularly fond of religion and the fanatic zeal that it all too often caused, such that the current Imperial doctrine was strictly atheist. But the Emperor also saw the immense opportunity afforded by an alliance with the Tech Priests. So, the Cult Mechanicus were allowed to maintain their technological theocracy in exchange for access to their vast weapons manufacturing capabilities with the Treaty of Mars. Now that the Imperium had the capability to expand and maintain its armies, the conquest to retake the stars began, known as the Great Crusade. Here is where we get to talk about Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes. Now, I would count this as a major event, but it just simply isn't in the grand scheme of all of Warhammer history. It's just another faction's version of super soldiers. But I'm still going to talk about it because it's cool. The Great Crusade was well underway, but the Imperium's might was getting spread too thin to effectively combat its mutant, heretic, and Xenos foes. So the Emperor returned to Terra and fabricated 18 soldiers, Primarchs, based off of the framework set by the Thunder Warriors. These Primarchs and their genetic blueprint, their gene seed, were then used to create massive frontline armies, unlike the smaller 1,000-man Space Marine chapters you love and adore. I'm talking legions, tens to hundreds of thousands of warriors each, to continue the glorious purging of Xenos. And gloriously purge they did, vastly accelerating the Imperium's expansion. It's also here that the Officio Assassinorum was founded, just in case you were wondering. Now it's at this point that we have to talk about one Primarch in particular, a man by the name of Horus. Horus was the Emperor's favorite son, and it was named Imperial War Master, essentially given control over all 17 of his brethren legions. I'm sure this will have no consequences whatsoever. I'm not even going to make a foreshadowing joke, because that's exactly what happens next. The blatant favoritism shown to Horus planted the seeds of resentment among the other Primarchs, and while those seeds were festering, the Emperor returned to Terra for reasons unknown, and the war was left to Horus, who began to have ye olde daddy issues, angry that he was left to fight his father's war. The combination of the tension between the Primarchs and the growing hatred between Horus and the Emperor eventually led to our final and most terrible major event, the Horus Heresy. Now, I'm aware that this video has gone on too long. I already know the retention on this video is going to be absolutely garbage. If you've made it this far, thank you. The TLDR of the Horus Heresy is basically the favored son had daddy issues, and that opened the door for chaos to weasel its way in and corrupt him and 8 other Space Marine legions, dividing the Imperial military in half and pitting it against itself in a brutally devastating 7-year civil war. In those 7 short years, literally 4.6 trillion casualties were amassed, and it ended in what could be considered a victory, but was really more of a stalemate when you think about it. Horus and the traitor legions were technically defeated and banished back into the warp, but the Emperor was left basically dead, the loyalist legions were divided into much smaller chapters, and the Imperium was destroyed literally beyond repair, which is where the 41st millennium and most Warhammer media takes place. The leftovers of the heresy trying to keep it together. So that's pretty much it. I could talk about the 41st millennium a lot. There's a lot to cover there, but like I said, this video is too long already, so I'm wrapping it up here. If you're still curious for more details about the Horus Heresy or the 41st millennium, there are a bajillion videos out there that can satisfy that. So hopefully I entertained you for a little bit. Let me know in the comments how I did. I unironically did it in 2,992 words, and subscribe for all 40,000 Hammers of War.